Let me talk briefly about land use, because this is really driven by development patterns, particularly in Clark County. And we know from this data from Census Bureau that Clark County's development pattern is extremely low density. In contrast to Oregon, where we have a strong urban growth boundary, Clark County does not. And it is developing rapidly and at densities that we know inherently do not support transit and that generate lots of single occupancy vehicle. In fact, their own analysis, CRC's own analysis, shows that 93% of the expected growth in morning trips in the I-5 corridor, or in the I-5 and I-205 corridors, will be from development in suburban fringe Clark County. That's their definition, not mine. So we're really talking about a project that's designed to accommodate very low density development in Clark County. And we know that Clark County has an incredibly dysfunctional one-way relationship with the Portland metropolitan area. Today, it's the case that commuters from Clark County outnumber Oregonians commuting to Clark County by about 5 to 1. And they're essentially anticipating that dysfunctional relationship continuing. Any kind of modest increases in either job growth in Clark County or reductions in population growth in Clark County, or a greater propensity of Clark County residents to work in Clark County, like we've seen in Washington County over the last 20 years, would mitigate, if not eliminate, the kind of congestion that they're talking about in the I-5 corridor. And that said, it's unreasonable to expect that simply adding additional capacity at the bridge and in the bridge influence area is likely to eliminate congestion. We know that there are other choke points in the system. And as you develop Hayden Island, as you relieve the existing bottleneck, we can be pretty confident that traffic will flow to other bottlenecks, and those bottlenecks will offset the system. And we know that there's a tendency for this induced demand phenomenon to wipe out the benefits of even very large increases in capacity. Let me talk next about cost and financing, because that is something you simply cannot overlook as you appraise this project. This would be, if built, essentially the largest public works project in the history of the region. $4.2 billion, just to do the math, works out to about $2,000 for every one of the region's roughly 2 million residents, or about $8,000 for each family of 4 in this region. Put in units that we are familiar with in the city of Portland, it is 80 OHSU trams. And I would suggest to you that you want to give it at least 80 times as much attention as was devoted to the OHSU tram, just to be sure that we don't make any mistakes there. Now, the funding of this is kind of difficult to talk about because all we have from the CRC is a 4-page so-called draft funding plan. And I'll focus just for a moment on the $3 billion that would go to the highway and bridge portion of the project. They've quoted a series of ranges, but I'll just round them off at roughly $1 billion from toll bonds, about $500 million estimated to come from earmarks from congressional legislation that has not been considered yet because it won't be until 2009. I'm pleased that Mr. Lyman has precognition about Congress and the fact that there will in fact be 2 separate pots, because I think it's pretty clear that this will compete with other kinds of financing, other kinds of financial needs that we have in the region. And it also assumes up to $1.5 billion of money that has to come from state and local governments in this region. Let me consider each of those items in a little bit more detail. As Mr. Lyman correctly noted, essentially the Federal Highway Trust Fund is broke. So future funding for this project assumes not simply the current level of funding, but that Congress actually increases the level of funding. And it also assumes that there'll be some sort of massive earmarks for this at a time when we know the political popularity of earmarks is declining. Second, when it comes to tolling, they made some pretty generous assumptions about their ability to bond against toll proceeds. And this is actually a relatively low quality project for tolling purposes. It's a greenfield, has no prior experience, and there's potentially, as they've described it, a competing free facility, all of which lower the amount of revenue you can expect. In addition, they have not prepared what is called an investment grade forecast. Now, investment grade forecasts are the forecasts that the Wall Street firms insist on before they will issue bonds for such a project, as they will not make the investment until they've had a really rigorous forecast. And I would ask that the public sector similarly not make its investment if it does not have what is called an investment grade forecast, which looks at it in a much tougher way. Finally, in terms of the local sources, we know that the existing revenues that we've identified in the Regional Transportation Plan, in the Oregon State Gas Tax, in Washington, are not adequate to fund this. So this hinges on raising a lot more money at the state and local level. If you financed it just in this region with a gas tax on the residents of this region, the 2 million residents, my estimate is it would require about a 15-cent a gallon gas tax region-wide to come up with $1.5 billion. So in terms of thinking about the desirability of this project, you should think about it, however you fund it, it comes in those terms. And then, as you think about this project and think about what it's worth, think about whether it is worth $15 for each commuter who crosses the bridge each day, because that's about what it works out to in terms of the cost. Now, I'm not saying anything about how you finance it,